colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Australian National Centre for Latin American Studies here to the ANU tonight for this public lecture by Professor Peter Wynne from Tufts University in Boston. The topic for tonight's lecture is, I think, one that is probably massively underdone in academia and generally in terms of publications and so on, but that increasingly is becoming obvious that it has been underdone, and more people, I think, are devoting energies now to researching the links between Asia, in this case China, and Latin America, which of course have existed for a very long time, as the lecture tonight I'm sure is going to point out, but it's now becoming increasingly obvious that they're really quite central to aspects of the world economy, world economic growth, to dynamic areas of the world economy now connected in ways that they haven't been before, and also as well to the political connections across the world in geopolitics. This has become an area probably that people like Professor Wynne, who studies, now will find himself in great demand to do speaking and writing engagements and so on. And he is indeed a very distinguished professor at Tufts University. He's taught as well at Princeton and Yale, and he's been a visiting professor and teaching in China itself. He's the author of many publications, which I won't go through. And would you please join me in welcoming Professor Peter Wynne.
I want to thank John for the invitation and the National Center for Latin American Studies for hosting me. And I want to thank all of you for coming out on a cold night. I'm going to take you on a very rapid journey through history from this 1571 to the present day, and from the Manila Galleon as well to what one might call the New Pacific Triangle. And let me start by putting this in the largest possible frame, which is that of global history. Since at least the times of the Silk Roads that linked the Han and Roman empires, China has always been an alluring partner for Europeans and their descendants. Prized by them as a mythic market of enormous size and wealth, and lusted after as a producer of manufactures from silks to porcelains that Europe desired, but could not produce itself at Chinese levels of quality and artistry. With the disintegration of the Mongol Empire and the conquest of the Middle East by the Ottoman Turks, the overland Silk Road between Europe and China became dangerous and costly in the 15th and 16th centuries. And Atlantic European powers, led at first by Portugal and Spain, then by Holland, France, and England, sought sea routes to the legendary riches of China. By the mid-16th century, the Portuguese had discovered the so-called short sea route to China around Africa and across the Indian Ocean, and established a string of fortified bases to protect their trade and threaten the trade of their Asian and European rivals. While the Spanish had explored the longer and more difficult journey around South America and across the Pacific from their new American empire in Peru and Mexico. The obstacle that remained, and let me introduce some sort of more modern terminology here, was not market access, which the Chinese allowed what they called the European barbarians on the same conditions as other foreign traders, but rather the problem was uneven development. In the 16th century, Europe was underdeveloped compared to China, and with the exception of mechanical clocks, which I think we can all agree was a niche market, there was very little that the Europeans had that the Chinese wanted. And therefore, the only way for Europeans to get those silks and porcelains they desired was by exporting gold and silver to China, which was in limited supply in Europe, and they wanted to keep that supply there. This obstacle to an expanding European trade with China was solved not in Europe, but in Spanish America, where the world's richest silver mines were discovered in the 1540s in Mexico, and what is today Bolivia, but then was part of the Spanish Viceroyalty of Peru. By 1600, more than half the world's silver was being produced in one mountain called Potosi, in what is today southern Bolivia. At the same time, Ferdinand Magellan, the first European to cross the Pacific Ocean from the Americas, had quote-unquote discovered and claimed the Philippines for Spain in 1521. And in 1565, the Spanish finally established a Philippine colony. In 1571, they established a fortified port at Manila in northern Luzon to serve not only as the base of their actually quite limited power in the Philippines, but more importantly, to serve as a base for their trade with China, Japan, and the Spice Islands of what is today Indonesia. By then, the Spanish had discovered that favorable winds from Mexico would permit a rapid and safe crossing of the Pacific from Acapulco, which was then a port, not a tourist trap, to Manila in 4 months. And that by sailing north, far north, to the 40th parallel, where winds blew west to east, they could make the more difficult return journey across the Pacific to the Americas. The following year, 1572, they also discovered that Peruvian and Mexican silver had a ready and expanding market in China, where taxes had to be paid in silver, and that Fujian merchants were willing to sail to Manila to trade Chinese goods for silver, but only for silver. From that point on, 1571 and 1572, annual Manila galleons, usually 2 sailing together, created the first sustained trade between China and Latin America, laden with American silver on the journey to Manila and with Chinese silks, porcelains, teas, and lacquerware on the return trip to Mexico. That return trip to Mexico was a difficult and dangerous journey of 6 to 9 months in the age of sail. It was the longest continuous navigation in the world at the time, with attacks by pirates and risks of fatal disease such as scurvy so high that the average mortality on the return journey was 75% of the crew and passengers. Only a quarter would survive on the average. And in 1 year, 1657, the Manila galleon, 3 months late, finally appeared sailing slowly off Acapulco with all hands dead on deck, a ghost ship, but with its precious cargo of Chinese trade goods intact. And that was the bottom line, that the profits to be earned on both sides were so great that Mexican merchants and Peruvian miners considered what they called the China ship worth the risk, and in fact smuggled far more silver onto the Manila galleon than the Spanish were aware of or allowed. In the 1 year they actually opened the hold to see what was there, it was 14 times the amount of silver that was in the manifest. What does that mean? It was greater than the entire Atlantic trade of Spain for the year. While for the Chinese, the rewards of the Manila trade and Chinese manufacturers for Latin American silver were so great that they came to Manila in ever-increasing numbers, turning a supposedly Spanish colonial capital into a Chinese port city of 30,000 by 1630, where there were 10 times as many Chinese as Spaniards. And a Spanish colony, unquote, dependent on the Chinese for both goods and services, for both skilled and unskilled labor. And the Chinese kept coming to Manila despite Spanish racism, Spanish regulations, and periodic massacres. By the late 16th century, therefore, economic relations between China and Latin America via Manila were well established, so much so that Manila itself was ruled from Mexico, formerly part of Spanish America, because it was an extension of Spanish America. And although the commodities and the terms of trade between the two regions have varied, along with the volume and the value of the commerce, there have been relations between them ever since. In the 18th century, Mexico replaced Peru as a chief source of silver for the trans-Pacific China trade. But the silver connection between Latin America and China remained strong throughout the Spanish-American colonial period. And the annual Manila galleons continued to sail until 1815, at the end of the Spanish colonial period. Now, while the impact on Europe of the trade in American silver to China via Manila has been explored by historians, its impact on Latin America has been largely ignored and remains mostly unknown, even today, although recent research has revealed some things that were very surprising. What we call the Manila galleon, Latin American contemporaries referred to as the nao de China, the China ship, and what we call, or the Spanish called, the Camino Real, the Royal Road, from Acapulco to Mexico City, and then to Veracruz, was known in Mexico at the time as El Camino de China, the China Road, underscoring the importance as it was perceived by contemporaries at the time. Historians tend to focus on the silver side of the trade of the Manila galleon, and on the European trade with China it made possible, neglecting the Chinese goods the American silver was traded for that remained in Mexico and Peru. Particularly important were the silk textiles, and not just as luxury consumption goods for the local elite. Chinese textiles and raw materials played a key role in the development of a silk textile industry in colonial Mexico. With superior Chinese silks, the basis of an industry that employed 14,000, an enormous sum for the time. Porcelains were also highly prized by Mexico's colonial elite and clergy, and formed the basis of the great chinoiserie collections still to be seen in Peru today. Chinese potters helped Puebla, Mexico, become the manufacturing and ceramic center of the New World, developing what was known as Talavera porcelain, which might be inferior to Chinese porcelain, but was a respectable imitation, including of Ming, Qinghai, blue and white glazes, that were all the rage in Europe at the time, and thus in Mexico as well. What this example calls attention to is the presence in colonial Mexico not only of significant Chinese trade goods, but also of important Chinese populations that we did not know existed before. And despite Habsburg regulations to the contrary, presumably only Spaniards were allowed to settle in Mexico, what we now know is that what we would perhaps call today illegal immigrants range from estimates from 40,000 to 100,000 Chinese in the Viceroyalty of New Spain, that is Mexico, during the colonial period. They arrived in Acapulco and fanned out from there throughout Mexico, although they tended to concentrate in the western provinces near Acapulco, their port of arrival, or in the major cities of the Pacific Atlantic trade routes and artisanal production, Mexico, Puebla, Veracruz. The first Chinese probably arrived soon after the Manila Galleon began an annual round trip in 1571. But the first documented Chinese was Antonio Perez in 1610, who'd been born in Macau, a Portuguese colony in China, and was a resident of Manila, who was granted a special license to travel to Mexico on the galleon. Why? Because he had a skill they wanted. He was a master gunpowder manufacturer. Now, you probably all know the Chinese invented gunpowder centuries before, but what may not be as well known is they remained the most skilled in its production and use. And the best artillery guns in the Spanish Navy were cast in Manila by Chinese artisans. So although in theory, only Spaniards were allowed to emigrate to New Spain, then as now, exceptions were made for people with needed skills, knowledge, and resources. As Spain's Manila colony was totally dependent on Chinese skilled labor and entrepreneurship, it was a natural source for skills that were lacking in Mexico as well, with Chinese shipyard workers, for example, and craftsmen from Manila prized in the shipyards of Acapulco. But there is evidence of a far greater variety of Chinese skills in colonial Mexico. Dancers, musicians, scribes, tailors, cobblers, butchers, embroiderers, coachmen, and especially barbers who performed medical procedures at the time, and goldsmiths and silversmiths, trades the Chinese dominated. And of course, Chinese merchants, especially sellers of textiles, but also of foodstuffs. In fact, the outdoor market in Mexico's Central Square was then called the Parian, after the name of the Chinese market in Manila. So important were Chinese merchants in that market. Chinese seamen and slaves probably came to Mexico in even greater numbers than skilled artisans and merchants, particularly during the first half of the 17th century, when the Habsburgs ruled over Portugal and its empire, as well as Manila and Mexico. Growing numbers of slaves were imported from Manila to Mexico to meet the labor shortage created by the demographic collapse of indigenous populations from Old World diseases. Many of these slaves were Chinese. Although there was no contract to bring slaves into Mexico, the Portuguese, the world's leading slavers at the time, were granted special dispensations to regularize the irregular. Many Chinese slaves were laborers. Others became status symbols as liveried servants. Many came from Portuguese Macau, where they had been converted to Christianity. And some of the most important decorations of the great Cathedral of Mexico were made by Chinese craftsmen, while its bell was made in Macau, symbolically connecting Mexico and China via the two main mechanisms in the colonial era, trade and migrants. Chinese migration to Mexico declined markedly after Chinese slavery was banned there in 1672, by which time the very meaning of the Spanish term Chino had undergone a transformation that disconnected it from Chinese ethnicity and transformed it into an official caste category that involved miscegenation between mulattoes and indigenous Amerindians. Go figure. The trade of Latin American silver for Chinese luxury goods, however, continued until the end of the colonial period. And as I mentioned earlier, the last Manila galleon sailed in 1815, 5 years after the Mexican struggle for independence had begun. Although the circulation of Mexican silver dollars in 19th century China suggested that trade between Chinese and Spanish America continued after Mexico won its independence in the 1820s, but the decline in mining output and foreign commerce in an unstable, independent Spanish America for most of the 19th century, and the instability as well in a China ravaged by civil war and imperialism, pointed to a decline in the levels and importance of the trade between the two Pacific regions. As a result, in the long history of the relationship between China and Spanish America, the 19th century is known as the century of indentured labor migration from China to Latin America, the infamous coolie trade. Between 1847 and 1874, some 125,000 Chinese indentured laborers made the journey to Cuba, still under Spanish rule, where they were mostly used as substitutes for slaves of African descent in the face of a declining slave trade that the British Navy was increasingly suppressing, and a sugar boom that required increasing supplies of coerced labor. During those same middle decades of the 19th century, another 100,000 Chinese coolies were imported into Peru on the west coast of South America to work the cotton plantations and especially the guano mines, source of the world's richest natural fertilizer. Chinese coolies tended to come from coastal southern provinces in China, like Fujian and Guangdong, recruited by Chinese middlemen, sometimes their own kin, transported across the Pacific, sold and often resold to private owners of plantations or mines in Spanish America, often in violation of the written contracts and local laws. Local laws usually specified that their passage was repayable by obligatory labor over 1 to 8 years, with severe restrictions on the coolies' mobility, but stipulated a monthly wage, free housing, food, clothing, and medical care, and empowered local courts to supervise compliance with these conditions. But breaches of regulations of work, such as desertion, insolence towards superiors, would be punishable by fines or imprisonment. But the reality was the state was weak and corrupt in mid-19th century Peru. It was controlled by local elites, who were given a virtual free hand in practice to treat their Chinese coolies as they wish. And as a result, all too often, they were treated like slaves. This is particularly true in Peru, which in theory had abolished slavery decades before. I have seen near Iquique, in the north of Chile, which was then part of Peru, the iron rings set in stone on barren rock outposts overlooking the sea, where Chinese coolies who protested their harsh working conditions, often in violation of their contracts, were chained and exposed to the elements in an area where temperatures could range from over 40 degrees Celsius in the day to below zero at night. Some of them left there until they died of hunger, thirst, and exposure as a didactic warning to their peers. And as women made up less than 1% of the migrants, their survivors' lives were harsh and lonely. As a result, most Chinese indentured laborers who survived their hard labor and harsh conditions returned to China. Although, unlike Indian indentured laborers in the British Empire, they had no right of return and had to pay their own passage. But some of them remained in Peru, where they were later joined by voluntary migrants in the late 19th and early 20th century. Some of them laborers, many more of them merchants or shopkeepers. These later voluntary migrations often reflected family, clan, and village social networks. For that reason, ironically, they tended to go to the same destinations as the previous indentured labor. State policies also played a role, positively and negatively, in shaping migration flows to Latin America from China. The Us Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 shifted Chinese migration south to Mexico in the late 19th century, where Porfirio Diaz, the dictator who ruled Mexico from 1876 to 1910, welcomed Chinese immigrants and even established diplomatic relations with Qing Empire in China in order to facilitate the number of Chinese he wanted to encourage to come to Mexico. They settled mostly near the Pacific ports and the Gulf oil fields, became small manufacturers and retail merchants, as well as supplying skilled labor. The first Chinese migration to Mexico since the colonial period, but surprisingly similar in its settlement patterns and economic roles. In Peru, over time, a mixed-race Chinese and indigenous Tucson community, Tusan, born in Peru, developed, whose estimated share of Peru's population today is as high as 15% of sharing some Chinese descent. Reinforced by new immigrant flows, held together by commercial and social networks that stretched across the Pacific, but with members of this community increasingly integrated into Peruvian social, economic, and political networks, including restaurants. If you go to Lima today, there is a special cuisine called chifa, which combines Peruvian and Cantonese recipes. By the 1980s, a changing Tucson community reflected new immigration streams from different areas of China. Over 18,000 ethnic Chinese immigrants were naturalized in Peru in the closing decades of the 20th century, with the community's post-1949 ties to Taiwan increasingly replaced by ties to the PRC, the People's Republic of China, whose communism and atheism might clash with the values of the mostly Christian and capitalist Tucsons, but whose economic success is admired by them, and whose economic expansion in Latin America, including Peru, increasingly incorporated them in the role of intermediaries, trusted by the Chinese for their ethnicity and their ability to speak both languages. China's state-to-state relationships with Latin America, however, came to an end with the 1949 triumph of the Communists in the Civil War and the establishment of the People's Republic of China, the PRC. In addition, most of the Chinese overseas community in Latin America remained loyal to the Kuomintang government in exile in Taiwan. Moreover, in the wake of World War II, Latin America was a U.S. sphere of influence in the early Cold War, and Washington forbade its Latin American allies from recognizing the PRC government or trading with it. In this situation, the PRC stressed what it called people-to-people relations, which in practice meant party-to-party relations, with the usually small Maoist parties or factions that existed in many Latin American countries, especially in the 1960s after the Sino-Soviet split. Some of these Maoist parties spawned armed guerrilla groups, as in Guatemala and Colombia, while the most successful in its bid for state power would be the ultra-Maoist Shining Path in Peru. Later, however, in the 1980s and 1990s, when its blood-soaked People's War claimed nearly 70,000 lives, and its cultist leader, Abimael Guzman, claimed to be Mao's successor, by which time Maoism would no longer be the dominant ideology in China itself, and the Shining Path would be shunned by Beijing, which would be denounced by the Shining Path as traitors to Maoism. In between, Mao himself would usher in a sea change in PRC foreign policy towards Latin America. First, by formulating his three worlds theory, in which Latin America was part of a third world of developing countries like China, which were potential allies in China's struggle against the first world of U.S. imperialism and the second world of Soviet revisionism. Secondly, by Mao's Look West policy that followed the historic rapprochement between Beijing and Washington, diplomatic revolution that followed the 1972 visit to China of Nixon and Kissinger, which ended China's diplomatic isolation in the Western Hemisphere and opened the way to a Chinese diplomatic offensive in Latin America, leading Beijing to refocus its policy towards the region from people-to-people relations to state-to-state relations. The United States was playing a double diplomatic game during this era, recognizing PRC as China at the United Nations, but continuing to support Taiwan economically and militarily. So it didn't press its allies in Latin America to recognize Beijing, but it also didn't oppose that if they wanted to do it. Together, these changes led to Beijing's establishment of diplomatic relations with 11 Latin American nations during the 1970s, including such major countries as Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, despite Argentina, Brazil, and Chile being ruled by anti-communist military dictatorships during the 1970s and early 1980s. From the Latin American perspective, during this era, China was a potential partner in the struggle of third world countries to create a new world economic order proposed by Mexico and others, which would be a more equitable distribution of resources between the first world and the third world. Some of these South-South third world cooperation relationships would carry over into the next decade of the 1980s. For Latin America, the lost decade, when its debt crisis triggered a deep and prolonged economic crisis of hyperinflation and recession, in which capital fled and unemployment and poverty soared. An era in which Beijing supported Latin American demands for forgiving its onerous external debt. Although PRC policy towards Latin America shifted during the Cold War era from party relations to state relations, what remained true throughout was that it was primarily political, not economic in character. It would take liberal economic reforms in both China and Latin America towards the close of the 20th century to transform their relationships into fundamentally economic relationships. Both embraced liberal economic reforms as a reaction to the heavy costs of state-regulated protected industrialization. But except for Pinochet's Chile, they did so a decade apart, with China starting its economic reforms at the end of the 1970s in reaction to the excesses and social and economic costs of Maoism, while most Latin American countries only accepted neoliberal economic reforms at the end of the lost decade of the 1980s, a crisis that was blamed on the strategy of import substitution industrialization and state economic intervention. Moreover, although China and Latin America both embraced liberalizing economic reforms that opened up their economies to foreign investment as well as foreign trade, they did so within significantly different economic models, and often with different results. China followed the East Asian development model, in which the state remained a powerful economic actor in partnership with the private sector, what would become known as the Beijing Consensus. While Latin America embraced the Washington Consensus promoted by the United States, the IMF, and the World Bank, neoliberal reforms that attacked the role of the state in the economy, and argued that the market was best, whether you're talking about economic policies or social policies, and that if the state gets involved, it would only screw things up. There were also major differences in practice between the economic strategies pursued by China and Latin America during the closing decades of the 20th century. Latin America recovered from its lost decade of the 1980s by doing one or two things. Either it reverted to its pre-1930s role as a natural resource, commodity-based, export-oriented growth model, or it became an offshore cheap labor assembly plant for outsourced labor-intensive operations of globalized production chains oriented to the US market. That was the Mexican, Central American, and Caribbean basin model. At first, China too seemed to be following Latin America's cheap labor maquila strategy, accepting seemingly every factory that any foreign investor proposed without imposing its own conditions. But gradually, as the Chinese became more confident, it became clear that they had their own strategy. That China was becoming the principal global outsource for basic manufacturing in the world, using foreign investments, technologies, and contracts as the base for building a powerful industrial sector that could both export and innovate, eventually scaling up from low-end manufacturing to increasingly sophisticated goods, including its own automobile industry, which is now having a major impact on Latin America. During the 1990s, Latin America became increasingly aware of China's emergence as a low-end manufacturing powerhouse, mostly because it competed with Latin American maquiladoras for the low-end export market in the United States. But with neoliberal tariff reductions, Latin Americans also had to confront competition within its own domestic economy from Chinese imports of manufactured goods that its own inefficient industries could not compete with. And also, China became a place where Latin American businesses themselves outsourced manufacturing to lower their costs. As a result, trade between Latin America and China increased from $1.4 billion in 1980 to $1.8 billion in 1990 to $12.5 billion by 2000. This era also saw the first significant direct investment by the PRC in Latin America. By 1997, some 200 Chinese companies had invested $1 billion in Latin America, mostly in natural resource extraction. But even this significant increase in economic relationships in the closing decades of the 20th century would pale by comparison with what has happened in the past decade. Let me take a step back first. Let's go back to where we started. At the start of our story in the 16th century, China was at the center of the world's economy. It was the maker and exporter of the sophisticated goods the Europeans could not produce themselves, but wanted, and which Latin American silver suddenly enabled the Europeans and the Latin Americans to purchase from China. During the 19th century, Europe's Industrial Revolution, however, transformed China into part of the pre-industrial periphery, a source of commodity exports such as tea, a market for European manufacturers, while the Industrial Revolution's military applications, i.e. gunboats, converted China into a semi-colony of European and Japanese imperialism until the middle of the 20th century. Although under the PRC in the second half of the 20th century, some Maoist policies, such as universal education, would later contribute to China's economic rise. For the most part, Mao's political purges, such as the Cultural Revolution, and economic experiments and disasters, such as the Great Leap Forward, set back China's development, kept it a third world country with pockets of industrial development, but it remained peripheral to the world economy until the closing decades of the 20th century. Then, beginning with the post-Maoist economic reforms at the end of the 1970s, but accelerating with each decade and taking off in the first decade of the 21st century, China built itself into an economic powerhouse that by 2012 had passed Germany as the world's leader in manufacturing exports, had passed Japan as the planet's second largest economy, had passed the United States as the world's largest manufacturer, and before the end of this decade will become the world's largest economy in absolute terms. By 2012, that's where we are now, right? Moreover, China had not only become the workshop of the world, but also the world's banker, including the largest creditor of the previous dominant industrial power, the United States, uniting the same conditions that enabled Britain to dominate the global economy in the 19th century and the United States in the 20th century. Transforming China then from the economic periphery of the industrial age into the dynamic center of the world's industrial economy. But now at the center of a globalized world economy, very different from that which China had dominated in the 16th century. A center of both manufacturing and finance that is now demanding that its currency become a reserve currency, like the dollar, and its continued dynamic growth and investment prevented, arguably, the US-generated crisis of 2008-2009 from becoming a global depression. For China, then, the first decade of the 21st century was a period of rapid continuous growth and industrial development that led to and consolidated its reemergence as a major global economic power, the dynamic center of the world economy. For Latin America, however, the first years of the new millennium had very different characteristics. Renewed cycles of economic crisis and slow recovery, with the meltdown in Argentina being the most dramatic example. Growing disillusionment with a neoliberal model in the Washington Consensus held responsible for the importation of external crises and for continued high levels of poverty and inequality. Increasingly, moreover, what we've seen in the last decade has been a growing economic and political division in Latin America along geopolitical lines. Between the Caribbean basin, Mexico, Central America, the northern coast, Colombia and Mexico of South America, and the Caribbean islands, the Caribbean basin, which is oriented to the US market in terms of three things: low-end maquiladora assembly exports, tourism, and equally important, maybe even more important than any of the above, migration. And therefore the remittances that migrants send back, $40 billion in Mexico last year, for example, have become in many cases the sustaining force of the economies of these countries and of family economies as well. They are, in many cases, the largest or one of the largest sources of foreign exchange. Moreover, these countries in the Caribbean basin have what is known as a high ESI. That's just one of those social science things. It means Export Similarity Index. Translation, they compete with China mostly for the US market. The exceptions to this US orientation are largely for political reasons: Castro's Cuba, Ortega's Nicaragua, Chavez's Venezuela. The other region is South America, south of the Caribbean basin. Here, with the significant exception of Brazil, you have a low ESI. You have economies that are fundamentally commodity exporting economies that are complementary to the Chinese economy rather than competitive with them. And interestingly, in the last decade, beginning in the year 2000, we've seen the election in these South American countries of leftist governments of diverse kinds, ranging from moderate social democratic governments to what you might call revolutionary populism. But what they all have in common is, in part because of their sort of leftist character, self-definition, they are open to China. They are open to the idea of closer relationships with the PRC. And in some cases, they're also looking to China as a way of decreasing their dependence on the United States and of increasing their autonomy. In the case of Brazil, Lula, for example, as president of Brazil, inaugurated a South-South diplomacy, trying to create another force within the world, which would include Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. This would lead then to a divided perception of China in Latin America. In the Caribbean basin, China is viewed as a rival for their share of the US market. During the first years of the 21st century, Mexico lost 200,000 jobs in the maquila industries on the borders of the United States to China. China is viewed as a threat to their own low-end manufacturing industries. And the perception is that there are greater costs than benefits to them from Chinese expansion. China talks about wanting to rise harmoniously in the world. It's not clear from the Caribbean basin perspective, whether they would consider this a harmonious rise. In South America, on the other hand, where you have a more complementary economic set of relationships, China's industrial growth and increasingly urban population has led to a great and growing need for South American natural resources: copper from Chile and Peru, oil from Ecuador and Venezuela, soybeans from Brazil and Argentina. All have led to growing Chinese trade and investment to obtain those resources and projections of even greater Chinese demand in the future. But even in South America, China is viewed both as opportunity and also regarded as a potential threat. As opportunity, China is an economic and strategic partner. It allows South America to diversify its markets. Their growing Chinese purchases are fueling South American economies, leading to rising demand and prices for their commodity exports. Growing Chinese direct investment and loans add to capital formation in South America and provide alternatives to the United States. In Argentina, the question is now asked, will China be the Great Britain of the 21st century for Argentina, pulling it into prosperity by its powerful economic engine, investing in infrastructure, buying its commodity exports? In Brazil, China again is seen as a diplomatic partner. In South America as a whole, there is a sense that China's emergence provides an opportunity for greater autonomy. And there's always a preference in Latin America for an economic power that doesn't seem to have political interests in the region. But China is also seen increasingly as potentially a threat. Why? Because it's seen as pushing South America back into its pre-1930s role as a resource-based export economy. The term that's being used now is called reprimarization, so the primary sector of the economy. And it's particularly seen in Brazil, which has spent decades getting to the point where it has a significant manufacturing base. And 37% of Brazilian exports are manufacturing exports. Brazil competes with China in African markets in terms of who's going to purchase their manufacturing exports, manufactured goods. So there as well, you see Brazilians saying we want to be an industrial exporter, not just a resource exporter. And there's a real ambivalence about China there in Argentina and elsewhere as well. And I think part of that is rational, and part of it is irrational. I think there's also a lack of comfort culturally between South Americans still, and China. There's still a sense that Chinese culture is alien to the region, and that there is, I think, a fundamental lack of trust, that people don't talk about it as much, but when you informally, privately, they do. Many Latin American leaders then are wary of China, and their future uncertainties, I think, which make this even more complex. It's not clear that all of China's foreign investment and loan offers will be accepted. It's not clear that all the investments that are promised will materialize. If past experience is a guide, the results will be more uneven than promised. But there is no question that China has erupted into Latin America in a major way, and in a very short time has become a major player in the economies of the region, especially in South America. Taking advantage of U.S. preoccupations elsewhere and neglect of Latin America in recent years, and of China's superior financial resources at a time of global financial crisis, China has expanded its economic role and influence. The key divide is only 8 years ago. It's really quite remarkable how much has changed. In 2004, the meeting of APEC was held for the first time in Chile, and President Hu Jintao of China visited Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, and took advantage of it to promise a dramatic increase in China's trade and investment, promising $100 billion in trade by 2010. He also journeyed to Brazil and talked to Lula and said, Lula, we want to buy your soybeans. And Lula said, fine, we sell our soybeans to everybody. You're perfectly willing to buy our soybeans. And Hu Jintao said, no, you don't understand. We want to buy all your soybeans. I think Latin Americans are still playing mentally kind of catch up with the scale of what the Chinese have in mind and what this represents, even while they're taking advantage of it. I shouldn't do this because I'm going over, but I'll just tell you an anecdote. And in 2009, I was co-directing a conference at Fudan University in Shanghai on China and Latin America, and I was trying to find a Brazilian to take part in this. And I had some connections with what would be the Brazilian equivalent of the kind of National Security Council that is not a cabinet member, but close advisors to Lula on policy in the presidential sort of realm. And so I sort of asked, who should we turn to for expertise in Brazil on China? And they got this blank stare. And then they said, well, I think there may be an old Maoist around from the 1960s. That's no longer the case. Now, throughout Latin and South America now, institutes on China are being formed. The Chinese are opening up Confucian institutes everywhere. There's a catch-up ball being played, but I think it's still there. There's still something of a lag effect between the realities of the importance of the relationships and the kind of recognition of it and understanding of the implications of it that Latin Americans are still working through. And that may be part of their discomfort, I think, as well. The crisis then was something that didn't take place in Latin America, in South America, I should say. It took place in the Caribbean Basin, oriented to the United States. But 2000, 2008, 2009 were good years for South American countries in terms of their exports. And they were good years, not because of Europe, not because of the United States, but because of China. And for the first time in history, South America didn't experience an even more severe crisis than the European origin or US origin of that crisis. And there was one basic explanation: China. But what was even more striking is that the most extraordinary expansion of trade between China and Latin America took place after the crisis. In 2010, there was a more than 50% expansion in China's trade with the region. And Hu Jintao's promise, $100 billion in trade by 2010, by 2010 it was $180 billion. It increased to $234 billion last year. It's slowing now because the Chinese growth rate is slow, but it's still continuing to increase. And capping an extraordinary surge, only since really in very few years, I think it's a very good sign for the medium and long-term future. As a result, China has mushroomed into the major trading partner of significant South American nations, passing the United States to become Brazil's leading trading partner. Brazil is the region's largest economy by far. It's also become the leading trading partner of Chile, the region's wealthiest country per capita, the second most important trading partner of Peru, Cuba, Uruguay, Venezuela. And significantly, China's exports to Latin America in 2010, mostly manufactured goods, grew more rapidly than its imports from Latin America. These statistics underscore other tensions between China and Latin America over China's relentless search for export markets for its manufacturers and a positive trade balance, as well as China's need for increasing quantities and volume of Latin American commodities. And there again is a disconnect. The negative trade balance in Latin America is the Caribbean basin. It's Mexico and Central America. The positive trade balance are South American nations like Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Argentina and Venezuela. China has shown some sensitivity to these concerns, with Hu Jintao promising to restructure China's trade with Latin America so as to make it more mutually beneficial. In Brazil, for example, China is building a steel mill next to the port that loads Brazilian iron ore for export to China, and is giving a major loan to the largest Brazilian iron ore company for it to build shipping in Brazil to carry that iron ore to China. In an accord signed 2 months ago, this is really up to date, this talk, China agreed to allow Embraer, the world's leading manufacturer of regional jets and Brazil's most successful industry, to manufacture planes in China, the world's biggest market, in a joint venture with a Chinese firm. This shows the Chinese are not rigid, that they will adjust. Another set of tensions arose recently when China sought to assure its future soybean needs by buying huge tracts of land in Brazil, to which they thought about importing Chinese labor to actually grow the soybeans. But they did this is something that had happened in Africa, and the Chinese have been able to do this in Africa. But Latin America, as you know, is not Africa. States are far stronger. National identities are far more consolidated. Nationalism is far stronger as well. And when the reaction in Brazil to this scheme proved strongly negative, the Chinese backed off and instead proposed lending money to Brazilian small farmers to grow soybeans for the Chinese market on their own land. Now, that's a winning economic and political formula in Brazil. Still, these gestures have not quieted nationalist critics of Chinese economic expansion everywhere. Significantly, Brazil's new president, Dilma Rousseff, a former leftist guerrilla in a movement noted for its anti-U.S. imperialism, is now encouraging U.S. economic interests to return to Brazil as a counterweight to China. We come to that. China's direct investment in Latin America is also multiplying, now around $10 billion, and is concentrated in the production and export infrastructure for commodities China needs. But more important than this $10 billion in direct investment has been the $40 billion in China's loans. The cash-rich China has offered Latin America, and what's interesting is the quid pro quo. $12 billion to the Brazilian oil company, Petrobras, to help it explore its deep-sea oil ventures. Another $12 billion, $28 billion in total to Venezuela for the tar sands of the Orinoco. And what's interesting in both these cases is the Chinese don't want the money back. The payments are not to be made in cash. They're to be made in oil. I mean, very clear what's going on. So the result of this rapid and aggressive Chinese economic eruption into Latin America has been a geopolitical sea change, whose full implications are still unclear, but which may prove to be world historical. One which has divided Latin America into two subregions, with the Caribbean basin countries, with a few political exceptions, still oriented towards the US, while most of South America, with a few political exceptions, such as Colombia, oriented towards China. It has brought China and Latin America into an expanding and deepening economic relationship with a value that their relations have not had since the Manila galleon ceased to sail, and which now far exceeds the volume and value of that ship's legendary precious cargo. But China's eruption into Latin America and the Caribbean has raised political eyebrows in the United States, which has long considered the region to be its sphere of influence, even its quote-unquote backyard. So far, the U.S. has been too preoccupied since 2001 with radical Islam to focus on Chinese economic expansion in Latin America. But questions have been raised in both South and North America as to whether China intends to parlay its large and growing economic role in the region into political influence or strategic positions, either in support of leftist regimes like Communist Cuba or Chavez in Venezuela, or in pursuit of other non-economic interests. This is certainly the case in Central America and the Caribbean, where roughly half of the countries in the world that still recognize the Taiwan government as the government of China, that's where they are. They're located in Central America and the Caribbean. Most of them are small, poor nations whose diplomatic loyalty was purchased by Taiwan aid and investment, but whose diplomatic recognition could easily be repurchased by the PRC, which now has more money than Taiwan. Although China recognizes Latin America to be a U.S. sphere of influence, in the absence of a pushback by a distracted Washington, Beijing has continued its expansion into Central America and the Caribbean, including military sales to Cuba and Venezuela, where it's also involved in oil prospecting, and has political links to aging leaders that, like its own leadership, share a socialist past and communist politics that still resonates. But as China's economic, political, and military expansion get closer to the U.S. border, its challenge to U.S. hegemony in the region becomes more apparent, and Beijing risks provoking the conflict with the U.S. that it claims it wants to avoid by rising harmoniously, especially if this becomes an issue in U.S. politics, such as who lost Latin America. The Cold War may be over, but it still resonates in both Washington and Beijing, a barely buried and printed button that is easy to reactivate and produce an automatic reaction. As is, China's eruption into Latin America since 2004 has created a new triangular relationship with the United States and Latin America, a complex relationship in which China and Latin America compete for market shares in the United States, where the U.S. and China compete for resources and influence in Latin America, and where both U.S. and China, however, recognize their relationship with each other is more important than the relationship that the other has with Latin America, and more important as well than their own relationships with Latin America, with the possible exception of Mexico and for the United States. It is unclear how this new Pacific triangle will evolve in the years to come. But given China's growing need for Latin American natural resources, given the U.S. view of Latin America as its sphere of influence, and given Latin America's search for economic and political autonomy, what is evident is that it's unlikely to disappear, and that its complex interactions and dynamics are likely to shape the relations between China, Latin America, and the United States for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was a fascinating talk, and one of, I think you'll agree, of heroic scope over 4.5 centuries and many, many issues. And issues which raise, of course, many questions. We have some time for questions and discussion now.
There are some skeptics who think that what happened with Japan may happen with China. As many of you are probably aware, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it looked as if Japan was going to be, quote unquote, number one, until its housing bubble burst, taking the population's collected savings down with it, and leading to the new Japanese economic disease, I guess is what it would probably be called. I think that China's manufacturing base has a kind of, it's a different dynamism than I think even existed in Japan, at that time. And I think that combined with this extraordinary $1 trillion sovereign reserve that the Chinese have is also solider in a way than Japan's was. At the same time, having lived in Shanghai, that housing market is certainly over, that's a bubble, there's no question about it. And the debt problem that I would worry about in China is not the national government, but the local governments, who, in order to encourage foreign investment coming in, or local investment, in fact, has often borrowed for infrastructure purposes. But that was true in Brazil also a few years ago. And yes, and what ultimately happened was the national government took that over. And it may have slowed Brazilian growth for a bit, and that might happen in China as well, but I think ultimately that would not be the case. So I'm more optimistic in a sense about the solidity and the dynamism in China. It feels just very, very different than Japan. And even at the time, much of Japanese the production that Japanese corporations were selling abroad, both in Japan and abroad, was often not done in Japan itself. And I think that's another major difference. I'm struck by a conversation that Steve Jobs of Apple had with Obama before he died. And it was at one of those dinners in the White House. Obama was making a big pitch for reindustrialization in the United States. And he said to Jobs, he said, 20 years ago, apples were made in the United States. Now they're made in China. What do we have to do to bring that back? And Jobs said, those jobs are just not coming back. And the explanation that he gave was interesting, because it wasn't the cost of labor, which, by the way, in China is now rising, and it's approaching Mexican levels at this point. He said there is nowhere else in the world that we had to triple production because of the demand for the iPad. And the Chinese said, fine, within 24 hours, we will have X thousand workers and Y hundred engineers working around the clock, and by the end of the month, we will triple production. He said, there is nowhere else in the world that you have that kind of concentration. And I think that's a more fundamental and more solid reason for thinking that this Chinese growth, that China has become the workshop of the world. In the same way that Britain was in the 19th century, mid-19th century, and the United States was in the mid-20th century. And the Chinese, in addition to that, they're not dependent on the low-end manufacturing anymore. And that's not their strategy. In fact, is to invest enormously in education, so that you will have educated and skilled Chinese workers who will then scale up, and those low-end manufacturing that will go to Vietnam, to Burma, to Bangladesh, et cetera. So I think that people often don't understand how sophisticated the Chinese strategy is. And in terms of innovation, I think too often my fellow citizens tend to think that, well, we're innovative, the Chinese just copy. Well, the reality is that more patents are being filed in China today than in the United States. And the amount of investment in research and development in China is far outpacing that of any other country at this point. So I think if you put all that together, I think you really have a much more solid projection, at least for the foreseeable future. There are questions down the road of whether the one-child policy will lead to an aging population with labor shortages in China. That may happen ultimately, but today there's still 200 million Chinese who have to come out of the rural economy for that economy to be modernly efficient. And that was the basis for the tremendously dynamic labor force over the last decades. And so I think one probably can predict that at least over the next couple of decades, China will continue to be the most dynamic economy in the world, and Latin America will continue to be dramatically affected by that dynamism, although, as I was suggesting, possibly in different ways in different places. Does Australia think of itself as potentially an intermediary between, China and Latin America? I don't know. I think that Australia is in many ways in a comparable position to Latin America vis-a-vis China. Its economy, again, is become, in terms of at least the relationship to China, largely a commodity exporting economy. But like several sophisticated Latin American countries, my understanding as well is that Australia has developed over the decades manufacturing capabilities that it would like to retain. And so there are those kinds of tensions conceivably. I think The greater risk of tensions is if there is a confrontation between the United States and China over China's aggressive expansion into Latin America. And the US says, this is our sphere, this is where we live, it's time for you to back off and back out, geographic fatalism. And if in that circumstance, China, like the Soviet Union did at one point in terms of missiles in Turkey and Cuba, turns around and says to the United States, we'll back off provided that you withdraw from our sphere, and whether China may consider that sphere to be not only East Asia and Southeast Asia, but even extending towards Australia. But this is just a speculation on my part. I think that maybe the question for Australia is, if I were Australian, and I'm not, if I were entrepreneurial, and I'm not, would be to say, can Australia play some kind of intermediary role in what's clearly going to be a very dynamic relationship between China and Latin America? And, but that's something for Australians to think about and decide, not for me. Well, you really made two very different points. Let me comment on both of them. Chile is a country I know very well. In fact, I've just come from there. And about a decade ago, a friend of mine was the Minister of Education. And I'd been in China and came back and tried to persuade him of the clearly growing importance of China as the purchaser of Chile's copper, and that it was really important for Chileans to begin to understand China and to start learning Chinese. And he got very excited about it, enthusiastic about it. He said, oh, no, forget it. He said, I'm trying to get Chileans to learn English. And even that, people say, learn English. They don't even know Spanish. If I tell them that I think they should start learning Chinese, it's, people laugh me off the street. But in fact, you're right. The Chinese have opened their Confucius Institute. The Foreign Ministry has 100 people learning Chinese. There's still very little understanding of China and of Chinese. My wife, who is a historian of China, when she goes to Chile, and she tells people what she does, that she's a historian of China, they say, you must be very enlightened. We're still back at that kind of exotic sort of image of the Chinese. But Chile was the first country in Latin America to negotiate a free trade bilateral treaty with China. This was part of Chile's global strategy. It's done this to a greater extent around the world than any other country has, but it's now something which other countries are beginning to follow. And so yes, there's no need for Chile to have Australia as an intermediary with China. It's established its own direct relationships. And in fact, at the world's largest steelworks, the Baoshan Steelworks in Shanghai, Codelco, the Chilean National Copper Company, has a permanent representative, as does Vale, Brazil's largest iron ore company, in which the Chinese have now bought a 10% share. So the degree of integration that you see there, I think, is really beginning to becoming very, very important. And today, no one in Chile would dispute the importance, because China is its leading trading partner, and the same is true in Brazil. I share your concern about the United States, maybe because I'm American, but not just because of that, but because I think we're heading for a situation in which there's an asymmetry of American power, in which the United States is declining economically in relative terms, not necessarily in absolute terms, but in relative terms, while it remains hegemonic in military terms. And what I worry about, in terms of my own countrymen, is what I might call the military temptation, the temptation to substitute military power for economic power, and the implications of that. I very much hope that does not take place, but I share your concerns. I think that, I agree with you. It doesn't necessarily translate into strategic terms. It might, and the areas at the moment of greatest sort of danger in that sense are Venezuela, which would like to pull the Chinese into a strategic relationship. Also, it would be a mistake to see China as speaking necessarily with one voice. Within the Chinese leadership, there are different currents, and the military often speak with great autonomy. And there is where I'm most concerned, because they've been pushing military sales to several Latin American countries. And so I agree with you, it doesn't necessarily lead to strategic interests, but it might. And if it did, I think that's what's most likely to be considered to be a provocation by the United States. The U.S., even because of its own ideology, finds it difficult to protest trade or investment. But where you involve political influence, and particularly where there seems to be some kind of military strategic involvement, that could be a very different sort of set of relationships. I was in China. I was in China as a visiting professor at Fudan University, teaching the first graduate course on Latin America ever given there. And to my amazement, because it was all MA and PhD students, I thought, oh, graduate course, fine. There'll be five people in the class who have been forced by their advisors to show up so that the gringo professor will at least have somebody there. And instead, there were 54 graduate students. I've never worked so hard in my life, I don't think. And I think that just tells you what has happened in China. And they were, as I got to know them better, they were all top students. And Fudan is one, it's like maybe the third best university in China. It's where most of the diplomats come from. And they knew that in their life, that if they do well at Fudan, they're going to be leaders of China. And that in their lifetime, they're going to be leaders of a China which is going to be a global power. And they said, we need to understand Latin America. And that to me was one of the most eye-opening things that I saw in China. And I think that just underscores what I've been talking about. This is not a flash in the pan. This is something which has been thought of, which is very conscious, and a relationship which for mutual interests, although complex and sometimes tense interests and countervailing, is not only something which is important today, but is going to become even more important tomorrow. Let me leave you with that thought.
Thank you. The sheer scale and rapidity of these changes is one of the things that amazes me. I met Peter for the first time at the Latin American Studies Association conference in San Francisco recently. And there I was on a panel of members of the executives of various professional associations about Latin America in the region of Asia and Oceania. And the Chinese representative from the Academy of Social Sciences said very, very modestly, we have very little about Latin America at our academy. We only have 60 full-time researchers. And the rest of us in the room looked around and wondered how many we had between us, and nothing like that. So the scale of these things and the serious attempt to understand Latin America in China is, I think, very, very real and very recent. But once again, please let me thank Professor Peter Wynn for an extraordinary talk, very interesting talk. Please, once again, thank him for joining us here tonight.